They called her too much before they even knew her name. In the hardscrabble town of Larkspur Ridge, nestled between the clawed fingers of the northern Rockies, there was little room for anything that could not be easily bent or broken. Men liked their women small and quiet, content to bake, bear, and bury their dreams before the first frost. A woman like Sabine Rowe did not belong. She stood nearly as tall as most men, shoulders broad from years of cattle driving with her father, hands raw and blunt from splitting wood and breaking horses. Her hair was a dark, unruly crown of waves that no bonnet could contain, and her eyes, a flinty storm gray, met the world without a flicker of apology. She laughed too loud, worked too hard, fought too stubbornly for a place in a world that only seemed to punish her for it. It was on her wedding day, when the words that had chased her all her life finally caught her by the throat. She wore no delicate silk or lace, but a simple dress of deep blue wool, stitched by her own hand, rugged enough to stand against the winds howling off the ridge. The groom, Elijah Cutter, a man with a square jaw and a coward's heart, met her at the altar with eyes already shadowed by regret. Before the preacher could even bind them, Elijah stepped back. His words, thick and clumsy, spilled into the silence like bile. "She's too much woman for me. I can't do it." A murmur rolled through the crowd. Sabine stood there, fists balled, face burning, as Elijah turned and fled down the aisle like a whipped dog. Behind him, mothers clutched their daughters, men chuckled under their breath, and the preacher closed his book with a heavy, embarrassed sigh. Sabine did not cry, she did not plead. She simply stood, an unclaimed bride on the church steps, while the world looked away. The days that followed were long and hollow. Larkspur Ridge had no place for a woman left standing at the altar. Offers came, but they were laced with cruelty, farmhands needing a sturdy mule disguised as a wife, widowers seeking a nursemaid for their feral children. Men wanted her strength but not her spirit. They wanted her hands, not her heart. Sabine refused them all. She took up work where she could, mending fences, hauling grain, wrangling livestock. Every hammer strike and rope pull drove deeper the iron into her soul. She would not be whittled down to fit into the narrow box the town had built for its women. It was during one of these bitter winters, with snow blinding the valley and the river frozen thick enough to crack, that a stranger arrived. He came out of the mountains one evening, riding a battered sorrel mare and dragging a sled piled high with furs. His coat was stitched from wolf hides, and his beard was a coarse, black snarl that half hid a mouth made for fighting or kissing. His name, he said, was Jonah Hale. He had the look of a man who had buried too many dreams to ever believe in new ones. Sabine first met him outside the smithy, where she was bartering for a new axe head. Jonah watched her from the shadows, arms crossed over his broad chest, saying nothing. When she hefted the iron axe like it weighed nothing, his mouth curved in the smallest, slowest smile. The town watched him too. They whispered about the gun slung low at his hip, the way he never bowed his head or lowered his voice. Men respected him or feared him, but they did not understand him. In that, Jonah and Sabine were alike. He spoke to her only once that day, as she tied the axe head into her saddlebag. "You split wood like you're splitting skulls," he said, voice rough as gravel. Sabine met his gaze squarely. "Sometimes it's not so different." Jonah laughed then, a low, rumbling thing that seemed to shake the cold right out of the air. In the weeks that followed, their paths crossed again and again. At the trading post, at the riverbank, in the dense hush of the pine woods, he never hovered or hounded. He simply appeared, solid and certain as the rising sun, watching her with that same unreadable glint in his eyes. The town, predictably, began to talk. Sabine heard the whispers as she walked the frozen streets. "She'll ruin him, same as she ruins everything. No man wants a woman stronger than he is. She'll be alone until the wolves take her." If Jonah heard them, he gave no sign. If anything, he seemed drawn to her stubbornness like a man thirsting for water he didn't know he needed. It wasn't courtship, it wasn't kindness. It was something older, something wilder, a recognition. One evening, when the snow bruised the sky purple and the smell of wood smoke curled thick in the streets, Jonah found her behind the blacksmith's shed, splitting cords of firewood by lantern light. She did not pause as he approached, the axe rising and falling in a rhythm carved by rage and resignation. He stood a moment silent, Then, without preamble, he spoke. I'm building a home up in the North Valley. Stone, timber, enough to last through the hard years. Sabine drove the axe deep into the block and turned. That so? He nodded. A home needs more than walls, needs a heart too. She wiped her hands on her skirts, wary. What are you saying, Hale? He met her gaze, steady as bedrock. I'm saying I want you at my side, not because you're less, because you're more. The words hit her like a fist. She had braced her whole life for rejection, for the slap of dismissal, but never for this, the raw, simple acceptance of her as she was. For the first time in years, Sabine Rowe did not know what to say. She stood there, the cold biting through her dress, the axe still quivering in the wood, and realized that sometimes the world did not give you justice. Sometimes you had to take it for yourself. And sometimes, if you were lucky, someone handed you not a rescue, not a refuge, but a sword. Jonah Hale was offering her not a cage, but a kingdom. She just had to be brave enough to claim it. The North Valley was no place for the faint-hearted. It was a wilderness stitched from jagged stone and shadowed woods, where wolves ran lean and elk ghosted between the trees. Snow could bury a man by morning, and winds could tear the breath straight from your chest. But to Sabine Rowe, it smelled like promise. She rode beside Jonah in the pale dawn light, the battered wagon creaking under the weight of their few possessions. There had been no wedding, no papers signed, no preacher called. Jonah had asked, and she had said yes. That was enough. The town had watched them leave with faces pinched like frost-bitten fruit. Sabine felt their stares bite her back like needles, but she did not turn around. She owed Larkspur Ridge nothing but her dust. For days they traveled deeper into the teeth of the mountains, carving a path through drift and undergrowth. Jonah spoke little, but his presence was a constant tether. When Sabine's mare stumbled in a rocky streambed, he was there, steadying her without a word. When the night turned so cold their breath froze in the lantern light, he built the fire higher, blocking the wind with his own body. Each day stripped another layer from her old life, left it scattered behind her like shed skin. The cabin was little more than bones when they arrived. Thick, hand-hewn logs formed the frame, and a stone chimney clawed toward the sky. The roof gaped in places where the weight of winter had chewed through it. Inside, the floor was still raw dirt, scattered with pine needles and the droppings of whatever beasts had taken shelter there. Sabine climbed down from the wagon and stared at it, heart thudding slow and deep. It was not a home yet, it was a battlefield. Jonah set to work without fanfare. They stripped rotted timber, patched the roof with tar and split shakes. She hauled rocks for the chimney, her fingers numb and bleeding. He felled trees higher up the slope, muscles straining, his shirt plastered to his back with sweat despite the bitter air. Together, they wrestled the wilderness into submission. At night, they slept wrapped in blankets on the dirt floor, close enough to feel each other's breath but not touching. There was a gravity between them, heavy and coiled, but neither reached across the space. There was time. Desire could wait until the walls were strong enough to keep it safe. The work was merciless. The snow fell heavy and wet, dragging the branches low, burying their tools if they set them down even for a moment. Firewood had to be chopped in endless cords, water hauled in heavy buckets from the half-frozen stream. Sabine's muscles screamed in protest, her hands cracked until they bled, but still she pressed on. Jonah never coddled her, never treated her as less. If anything, he pushed harder, knowing she could bear it. Respect was a currency she had never been rich in before, and she spent it gladly. Weeks bled into months. The cabin grew around them, walls chinked tight with moss and mud, a roof thick enough to bear the weight of storms, a hearth that roared with life. Sabine carved shelves from pine slabs, lined them with rough clay jars she shaped by hand. Jonah built a heavy door from cedar planks and hung it on iron hinges he had smithed himself. They did not speak of what they were building between them. They did not have to. It was during the spring thaw, when the rivers heaved with meltwater and the bears began to stir, that the first test came. Jonah was out checking the traps along the ridgeline when the stranger came. Sabine was tending the fire, the hem of her skirt dark with mud, when she heard the crunch of boots in the yard. She rose slowly, the fire poker heavy in her hand. The man was a drifter, lean and yellow-eyed, his coat stiff with old blood. He smiled wide, teeth black with rot, and tipped his hat in mockery. "Well now, what's a thing like you doin' way up here all alone?" Sabine said nothing. She watched the way his hand hovered near the pistol slung low at his hip. The drifter took a step closer, then another. "Ain't no one around to hear you scream, sweet girl." Still Sabine did not move, did not blink. When he lunged, she swung the fire poker with every ounce of strength in her body. It struck the side of his head with a sickening crack. He dropped to his knees, cursing, blood streaming from his temple. Before he could rise, she was on him, driving the iron rod into his gut, twisting, driving again. He clawed at her, eyes wide in disbelief. But Sabine had long since learned that mercy was a language best left unspoken. By the time Jonah returned, the drifter was crumpled in the mud, a red ruin of the man he had been. Sabine stood over him, chest heaving, hair wild, the poker dripping red onto the thawing earth. Jonah took it all in with one slow, measured glance. He said nothing, only reached down and hauled the corpse into the woods. When he returned, he knelt and washed the blood from her hands with snow, his touch firm and wordless. They burned the drifter's coat and boots that night. Let the wolves have the rest. Neither spoke of it again. The valley took things from people, took their softness, their fears, their illusions. Sabine had always known she was built for surviving. What she had not known was how it would feel to be seen, whole and without shame, by someone who could survive beside her. That night, for the first time, Jonah pulled her into his arms, not to soothe her, not to claim her, simply because he could and she let him. Their bodies fit together, not like pieces of a puzzle, but like two weapons laid side by side in the dark. And outside, the wolves sang to the moon, wild and free and unafraid. Spring in the North Valley was a slow violence. The ice wept into the rivers. The trees stretched out their blackened fingers toward a brittle sun. Life crawled back in fits and starts, raw and hungry. Sabine planted what seeds she had managed to save from the town, a few shriveled beans, a handful of corn, stubborn shoots of cabbage, and prayed to a god she did not trust that they would take. Jonah cleared a field further up the slope, ripping the stubborn roots from the earth like bad teeth. He set snares deeper into the woods, and Sabine learned to skin and gut without flinching. Blood became a daily texture, a reminder that survival had no polish, no ceremony. Their rhythm grew harder, sharper. The world demanded more and more from them, and they gave it willingly. One night a storm came roaring over the peaks, a black wall of thunder and hail that battered the cabin until the walls groaned and the roof shuddered. They huddled close to the hearth, watching the fire gutter under the draft, listening to the furious bellow of the wind. Lightning split the sky open, revealing for a breathless instant a figure standing at the edge of the tree line. Sabine saw it first, a lean, crouched shape too large for a man, too upright for a beast. Jonah rose, hands slipping to the rifle propped near the door. The creature did not advance, it watched. Long after the lightning had faded, they could feel its gaze, hot and unnatural, crawling along the walls. The next morning they found tracks, huge, clawed prints sunk deep into the soft earth. They wound in circles around the cabin, as if whatever had come had been measuring it, weighing it, waiting. Jonah muttered something low under his breath that sounded like a prayer or a curse. They fortified the cabin after that, reinforced the door with iron straps, nailed boards across the windows. Sabine crafted crude alarms, bells strung with tripwires, sharpened stakes hidden in the brush. There were worse things in the wilderness than wolves. The uneasy truce of their life was broken. Jonah grew restless, ranging further afield during the days, setting traps and hunting sign of whatever had come stalking them. Sabine tended the homestead alone, always with one ear cocked to the trees, one hand near a weapon. Loneliness was a hollow she knew well, but this was different. This was vigilance, a constant, gnawing readiness that wore her nerves thin as paper. It was during one of those tense afternoons, the air thick with the smell of rain and wild mint, that a rider appeared at the tree line. Not Jonah. A stranger, cloaked and slouched, leading a sway-backed mule. He bore a long rifle slung across his back and a look of slow calculation. Sabine stepped onto the porch, shotgun cradled in her arms, silent. The man reined in his mule, but did not dismount. "Look in for Hale," he said, voice cracked from dust and whiskey. "He's not here." The man's eyes flickered, taking her measure the way a butcher might a side of meat. "Shame," he said. "He owes men who don't forget." Sabine said nothing. The rider spat into the dirt. "Tell him the debt's due, one way or another." Without waiting for a response, he turned and rode back into the trees, leaving a trail of broken silence behind him. That night when Jonah returned, Sabine told him of the messenger. She watched the way his jaw tightened, the muscle jumping like a snared rabbit. "Old debts," he said finally. "Before this place, before you." He would say no more. The shadow of it hung between them, thick, unsaid. Sabine knew the weight of secrets, the way they could rot the beams of a life if left too long. But she also knew that a man could not be dragged from his past by force. He had to come to it himself, bloodied or not. And so she waited. Summer bled in over the mountains, hot and ruthless. The rivers shrank to muddy veins. The game grew scarce. The crops withered under the sun's pitiless eye. Sabine learned to trap small game, to find wild roots and edible greens. She wove snares from willow branches, fished the deep pools where the water still ran cold. It was not enough. The debts came due in other ways. One evening, as the light fell in long, slanted blades across the valley, Sabine found Jonah standing at the edge of the clearing, staring eastward, rifle slung across his back. "They'll come," he said, not turning. She stood beside him, the air between them thick with things they could not name. "Let them," she said. He looked at her then, truly looked, and whatever he saw there stripped the last of the hesitation from him. He reached for her, hands rough and certain, and she went to him without fear. They married themselves under the bruised light of the coming storm, without words, without witness, sealing the vow with the taste of each other's breath. There were no promises of peace, only the shared understanding that survival was a war and they would fight it side by side. The storm broke open above them, washing the valley clean. But the blood was still coming. They both knew it. The men came at dusk. There were 4 of them, riding hard out of the eastern woods, their coats flapping like wounded flags. Dust and hunger rode with them. Their faces were shuttered, hard with the grim certainty of men who had done violence before and were ready to do it again. Sabine spotted them first, their silhouettes black against the bleeding sky. She was on the roof, patching a loose shingle, the hammer freezing halfway to the nail. She climbed down without a sound, blood drumming in her ears, and crossed the yard to where Jonah was sharpening a knife by the chopping block. "They're here." He looked up, saw what she saw, and slid the knife into his belt. There was no panic, only the cold, sure understanding that the fight they had been promised was finally upon them. Jonah loaded the rifle with steady hands. Sabine took the shotgun, checked the shells, tucked a knife into her boot. They spoke no words of farewell. Words were useless now. The riders fanned out as they approached, forming a loose crescent around the cabin. Their leader, a man with a scar cleaving his face like a river through stone, reined in first. "Hail," he barked. His voice was a whip-crack across the clearing. "You've run long enough." Jonah stepped forward, rifle cradled easy but ready. "I paid my debt in blood," he said. "Ain't my fault your master wanted more than a man could give." The scarred man grinned, a wolf's smile. "Your blood wasn't enough, nor hers." At that, Sabine felt the world tighten inside her, a knot hard and hot in her gut. She moved to stand at Jonah's side, no shrinking back, no hiding. The men dismounted. Each one carried a weapon, rifle, pistol, blade. Their movements were slow, almost lazy, confident. They thought it would be easy. The first shot cracked the air open. Jonah dropped one of them clean through the chest, the man staggering back with a grunt before crumpling into the dirt. The others roared and charged. Sabine fired once, the shotgun kicking against her shoulder, and another man spun away, clutching his shredded thigh. Then it was hand to hand, brutal and close. Sabine ducked under a wild swing of a hatchet, driving her knife up into the attacker's ribs. Hot blood splashed her arm, and the man sagged against her, dying with a choked curse. She shoved him off, spinning to face the next threat. Jonah grappled with the scarred leader, their bodies a tangle of fists and fury. The rifle was lost in the dirt. Jonah fought like an animal, all raw strength and brutal efficiency, but the scarred man was vicious and desperate, fueled by something older than anger. Sabine lunged toward them, but a hand seized her hair, yanking her back. She staggered, twisted, drove her elbow into the man's throat. He gagged, and she finished him with a savage thrust of her knife. By the time she reached Jonah, he was on his knees, blood running from a gash over his eye. The scarred man stood over him, pistol raised. Sabine did not think, she moved. She slammed into the man with her full weight, knocking the gun from his hand. They tumbled into the dirt, rolling, grappling. He was stronger, but she was meaner, more desperate. She bit, clawed, gouged. There was no grace in it, only survival. She found the hatchet the man had dropped and brought it down, with a scream torn from the marrow of her bones. The blade bit deep into his neck. He spasmed once, twice, then stilled. Silence fell. The clearing was littered with bodies, the dust settling like ash. Jonah staggered to his feet, wiping blood from his face. His gaze found hers, raw and wild, and for a moment neither of them moved. Then he reached for her, and she let herself be gathered against him. They stood like that for a long time, the dead cooling around them, the valley swallowing the last echoes of the fight. When they finally moved, it was slow, deliberate. They dug shallow graves at the edge of the woods, far from the cabin, far from the life they meant to build. Sabine did not flinch as they worked. She had buried too many things already: hope, innocence, trust. Burying bodies was easy in comparison. When the last grave was filled, Jonah pressed a rough kiss to her temple. "You saved me," he said, voice cracked and hoarse. Sabine shook her head. "We saved each other." The stars burned cold above them, sharp and clear. They had not asked for this life, had not been given it as a gift. They had forged it with blood and fire and grit, had clawed it out of the jaws of the world that had tried to grind them down. And they would keep it. Not because the world allowed it. Because they took it. Because they were too much for anything less. Summer gave way to a sharp, golden autumn. The fields Jonah and Sabine had broken open with their hands began to yield. Beans climbed rough trellises. Corn rose stubbornly against the wind. Squash sprawled fat and ungainly over the dark, rich soil. Each stalk, each leaf, was a small defiance against the dying season. The valley had tested them and found them worthy. Their home was no longer a battered cabin at the edge of nowhere. Jonah shaped a new porch from cedar, where Sabine strung drying herbs in tangled ropes. She tanned hides behind the barn, stitched new clothes by firelight, whittled spoons and bowls from the thick-bellied pines. They built a smokehouse, a small barn for the mare, a fence stout enough to turn wolves. It was not prosperity, but it was survival, and it was theirs. The graves by the tree line grew mossy, forgotten by everything but the crows. Sometimes Sabine would catch the glint of bone when the rains were heavy, but she never tended them. The dead had no claim here. This was a land for the living. As the days shortened and the nights sharpened, Jonah changed. The hardness he had carried for so long, the weight of debts and past sins, seemed to burn off him like mist under the rising sun. He smiled more small, rough smiles that warmed Sabine better than any fire. He sang sometimes when he worked, low, tuneless hums, as if the land itself had loosened his throat. And Sabine, who had been called too much her whole life, too tall, too loud, too fierce, found that in the wild North Valley she was exactly enough. There were no mirrors in the cabin, no glass to catch her reflection, but she felt the shape of herself growing sharper, stronger. Her hands were calloused. Her shoulders bore the weight of survival with ease. Her voice, when she used it, carried through the timbered air like the crack of a rifle. Jonah loved her not despite these things, but because of them. He touched her like a man anchoring himself to the world, fierce and reverent. When he spoke to her, it was not in the small, patronizing tones of the town men, but in the plain, steady language of equals. Winter warned its coming with early frosts. The leaves burned bright and fell. The wolves circled closer. Sabine and Jonah laid in stores, patched the roof, slaughtered a doe, and smoked the meat. One night, as the first snow sifted down from the black sky, Sabine sat by the fire mending a tear in Jonah's coat. He watched her from the other side of the hearth, his face caught between light and shadow. "You think we beat it?" he asked quietly. "The world that wanted us gone." Sabine tied off the thread, bit it clean, and looked at him. "We didn't beat it," she said. "We outlasted it." Jonah smiled, slow and sure. "That's enough." She crossed the room to him, laid the coat aside, and climbed into his lap. He gathered her close, hands steady on her waist, forehead pressed to hers. Outside, the snow thickened, burying the world in silence. Inside, they built their own season, a slow, enduring blaze that no storm could touch. Years would pass, hard years, lean years, years salted with loss and stitched with joy. They would raise animals, carve new fields, bury friends, maybe someday children. The world would not soften for them, and they would not ask it to. But the cabin would stand. And within its walls, the girl who had once been rejected for being too much would live without apology, without shame. A woman shaped by wilderness, tempered by fire, held not in spite of her strength but because of it. And the man who had seen her, not as a burden, not as a prize, but as a partner, would stand with her against everything the world could throw. Not because they were promised forever, because they had chosen it. Every damn day. And that was enough.